Good evening. I am Dr. Matt Davies, Senior Lecturer in International Political Economy at Newcastle University. Welcome to tonight's Insights virtual lecture titled Revolting, the Political Significance of Punk Around the Globe by Professor Kevin Dunn. I will be back after the lecture for a live Q&A with the speaker. If you would like to submit a question, you may do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen or via Twitter at InsightsNCL. If you're tweeting about the event and want to share your thoughts, please use #InsightsNCL. It's both an honor and a real thrill to introduce Kevin Dunn to you all tonight. Kevin is a professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, which is in upstate New York in the USA. He is the author or editor of over 10 books, many of which focus on the politics of the Great Lakes region in Central Africa, but also include a book he co-authored with Iver Neumann on discourse analysis for the social sciences, and, most relevant for this evening's lecture, his 2016 book, Global Punk, Resistance and Rebellion in Everyday Life. Kevin is an especially well-suited lecturer for our Insights series, thanks to his long-standing engagements with the wider communities beyond his academic employment. I was lucky enough to see this commitment firsthand when Hobart and William Smith hosted the 5th Popular Culture and World Politics Conference in Geneva, which gave the town a chance to showcase its rich and diverse history of cultural and social engagements, which included many of Kevin's own initiatives for the town. Kevin also runs an independent record label, Girth Records, and has played in various bands. He is also a frequent contributor to the magazine Razorcake, of which he's very proud. Kevin will be joining us for a live Q&A after the lecture.
Hi, I'm Kevin Dunn. I want to thank everyone for the opportunity for being part of this Insights virtual lecture series at Newcastle University. It's an honor to be asked to be here, and I'm very thankful for you for logging in and watching this. I'm talking today about the political significance of punk across the globe, and my core argument is pretty straightforward. Since the emergence as a cultural force 4 decades ago, punk has become an important vehicle for giving individuals and communities resources for resistance and rebellion in today's global capitalist world. That is, punk is a global phenomenon of political significance. But what is punk? I mean, you probably have images in your head of kids with mohawks and leather jackets and chains, and maybe some bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. For me, it's more than just music. I understand punk to be a social practice or sets of social practices. What made early punk bands like the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, Damn, the Slits, the Clash, X-Ray Specs, and all the like, what made them punk was not so much how they sounded, but how they acted. Punk worked to imagine new ways of being. As they loudly proclaimed at the time, they were sick and tired of the crap that mainstream culture was shoving down their throats, whether it was music, art, literature, or fashion. And they decided to make their own cultural products. Punks did so and continue to do so by making their own music, being their own journalists and writers, making their own movies, designing their own clothes. It's a 2-part process, a rejection of the status quo, an embrace of a do-it-yourself DIY ethos. So when I talk about punk as a set of social activities, as opposed to a specific fixed musical style or fashion of clothes, I'm particularly focused on these notions of an anti-status quo disposition and the ethos of do-it-yourself, which is why I often use the term DIY punk to draw attention to the difference between the organic cultural products that emerge from a DIY punk community and those of commercial punk, those punk products sold by major record labels and trendy mall stores. DIY punk is politically significant in ways that commercial punk is not. In fact, the commodification and appropriation of punk has frequently undermined the effectiveness of DIY punk's political and social relevance. But in the end, being a DIY punk has little to do with what you're wearing or listening to, and everything with how you choose to interact with the world around you. In large part, the emergence and success of punk was a response to the capitalist relationship to culture. On the one level, there was a rejection of the banal cultural products that were being sold to people, to punks, from music to fashion. This is pretty well-worn territory, and most books and documentaries about the emergence of punk will often juxtapose the stagnant behemoth rock stars like Genesis, Yes, Pink Floyd, and their ilk, with the three-chord misfits that became the punk vanguard, whether they be Dictators or Dickies, Ramones or the Slits. Now, I don't want to belabor the point too much, though it is a highly important one because one must understand that punk from its outset was fundamentally anti-status quo. On a more important level, punk champions a DIY ethos. Of course, punk was not the first cultural form to champion DIY. While certainly not claiming to have invented the wheel themselves, punks did breathe fresh life and explicit political sensibility into DIY culture. The DIY ethos became one of the defining features of punk rock scenes as they emerged in the 70s and into the 80s and beyond. One of the best known examples of punk's DIY ethos was this widely circulated drawing of how to play three chords on a guitar, accompanied by the caption, "Now form a band." One of my favorite quotes about punk's connection to DIY was offered by Daniel Sinker, the founder of the magazine Punk Planet, who pointed out that, quote, "Punk has always been about asking why and then doing something about it. It's about picking up a guitar and asking, why can't I play this? It's about picking up a typewriter and asking, why don't my opinions count? It's about looking at the world around you and asking, why are things as fucked up as they are? And then it's about looking inward at yourself and asking, why aren't I doing anything about this?" End quote. And that quote captures a number of key aspects I consider important for my conversation here. On one level, it captures that anti-status quo aspect of punk. In a sense, punk is reactive or responds to the injustices of the world, but it's also prescriptive. Through its employment of DIY, punk offers a guide for action and self-empowerment. Instead of passively accepting the world as it is, punk inspires people to do something about it on a personal level. Don't wait for someone else to fix what's bothering you. Do it yourself. Or as the oft-quoted punk slogan goes, do it yourself or do it with friends. At the same time, DIY punk provides both an active rejection of the way things are, questioning the naturalness of the social order, while also calling into being alternatives, other ways of thinking and being. As such, DIY punk helps produce oppositional identities. In this way, punk not only challenges the naturalness and inevitability of the accepted orders in society, but it enables individuals to construct alternative forms of identity that are in opposition to societal norms and the political and economic practices underpinning those norms. By embracing a DIY ethos, punks transform themselves from passive consumers to active agents of cultural production. Punk provides a rejection of passivity and a championing of personal empowerment. And there is enormous potential there for political power. Individuals, of course, do not exist in a vacuum, but are part of a larger social groupings. What we can think of as scenes. Scenes serve to strengthen, protect, and nurture while encouraging others to engage in similar practices, filtered through their own needs, desires, and experiences. My key point in this talk is that local punk scenes can be sites for political engagement. There are numerous historical examples from across the globe that illustrate how DIY punk helped provide resources for individuals and communities in their struggle against the political status quo. I'll provide a discussion of three scenes: Northern Ireland, Indonesia, and Myanmar today. And given my UK audience, I might spend a little more time talking about Northern Ireland. Now, these scenes are intentionally not the usual suspects studied in the literature on punk scenes, which tends to focus on London or New York or LA. The three cases I've chosen in order to reflect the global scope of punk, but also because they span the 4 decades of DIY punk so far. So let me begin with talking about Northern Ireland. If you go to the Ulster Museum in Belfast, Northern Ireland, there's an exhibition there on the Troubles, that era of political violence that claimed more than 3,500 lives over 3 decades. It was a time of bombings, assassinations, random terrorism, and armed repression involving the British Army, the police, and competing Republican and Unionist paramilitary forces. The Troubles defined every aspect of life in Northern Ireland from the late 1960s until the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement established a precarious peace. In the center of that first room of the multi-room exhibit there, the Ulster Museum, with its almost 4 decades of trouble-related artifacts, there's this mannequin on display, dressed in a spiked black leather jacket with Outcast hand-painted on the back. And the card accompanying it reads, "The Outcast are a Belfast-based punk band formed in 1977. This outfit belongs to Greg Cowan, lead vocalist." One might well ask why a punk's jacket is in the middle of an exhibit on the Troubles. But Northern Ireland's punk scenes were both a product of and a response to the crippling violence that characterized everyday life for the population, especially the youth. Moreover, a discussion of the peace process in Northern Ireland that fails to take into account the punk scenes and their activism is woefully inadequate. The usual markers of achieving peace, things like ceasefire announcements and the signing of peace deals, such as the Good Friday Agreement, are done by politicians and generals, but the slow process of peace building is often intangible and conducted at the grassroots level. This often entails average people actively defying the violent social divisions of their everyday life and forging alternative visions of the future. In Belfast in Northern Ireland, it was the punks who helped lead the way. The punk scenes created important non-sectarian spaces in which social networks were built, alternative ways of being were imagined, and campaigns of political and social activism were realized, helping make the peace process a reality. Now, despite the common portrayal of the conflict in Northern Ireland as a religious struggle, it was first and foremost a political conflict. While the rest of Ireland became independent in 1922 after a brutal armed struggle against the British, 6 counties in the northern province of Ulster remained part of the UK. At its core, the Troubles were about the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, with Unionists, Loyalists wanting to remain in the UK, and Republicans, Nationalists wanting to join the Republic of Ireland. However, the conflict was often framed in terms of religious sectarianism, Catholic versus Protestant, and ethno-nationalism, Irish versus British, thus imbuing it with complex and problematic aspects of identity politics. By the 1970s, well into a decade of the Troubles, Northern Ireland was suffering from profound economic stagnation. Unemployment was high with very little prospects for youth entering the dismal job market. Industry had been declining in Belfast. For youth across Northern Ireland, future economic prospects were markedly grim. This desolation had its physical manifestation in city centers like Belfast and Derry, where the paramilitary bombing campaigns had turned those city centers into no-go zones. In Belfast, the central zone emptied as soon as the workday ended, and the British Army erected physical security barricades that encircled the city center in order to keep the bombers out. Everyone stayed in their segregated neighborhoods, which in turn were typically protected and policed by paramilitary forces. Protestant youths, for example, would rarely stray out of their Shankill neighborhoods, while Catholic youths hunkered down in the Falls, even though both neighborhoods directly neighbored on each other. Within one's neighborhood, the youth encountered stultifying sectarianism, where conformity to the cause, whichever cause, was violently enforced. At the same time, youth across Northern Ireland had very limited access to popular culture beyond the limited and regulated radio and television stations, with the significant exception of Radio Free Derry. Many observers credit the creation of the Belfast scene to the Clash's October 1977 concert there. The show was actually canceled, and the disappointed fans decided to physically express their frustration, triggering a violent police response. The ensuing confrontation became known as the Riot of Bedford Street, and the band Rudy would later immortalize the event with their song Cops. Martin McLuhan, a professor of media studies, wrote, quote, "On that night, the individual punks of Belfast coalesced into a scene, and many of the bands that would emerge in the next few months could trace their genesis back to these events." End quote. It's a good story, but it's not entirely correct. The Clash weren't the first punks to play in Belfast. There were already several local punk bands in existence before the Riot of Bedford Street. There was already a lot of punks in Belfast, but as McLuhan points out, they just hadn't met each other yet. Now, like most scenes, the Belfast punk scenes came in waves. Many of the bands associated with that initial burst of activism, such as Stiff Little Fingers, Rudy, The Outcasts, and The Undertones from Derry, signed to major record labels, and or they tried their luck in England and beyond. Some of the older punks that were involved grew out of the scene and settled into adult life. But another wave of punk emerged, grounded in the initial ethos of the first, but also decidedly different. Initially, the focal point was on the Anarchy Center, also known as the A Center, that hosted regular all-age punk gigs, including the English anarcho band Crass. And it was Crass's dedication to both that DIY ethos of activism and an anti-hierarchical anarchism that greatly informed the second wave of Belfast punk. While that first wave in the late 60s, 70s, early 1980s garnered a great deal of attention, the more underground second wave of the 80s and 90s, built around places like Gyros and associated with a war zone collective, put many of the ideas into practice, and by doing so, made a reality out of the promise of an alternative Ulster, to borrow from the Stiff Little Fingers song. One of the ways Belfast punks affected the politics of every day was by creating safe, non-sectarian spaces, first at places like the Harp, and then at the A Center and Gyros. In these spaces, connections were made and communities were built. Scenes can function as conduits for collective action. There is, after all, strength in numbers. As such, scenes serve to strengthen, protect, and nurture, creating an emotional community that can help promote political activity. In the highly polarized Belfast context, these connections and personal networks that were established significantly altered the social landscape of the city. The importance of this cannot be stressed enough. Initially, what made a place like the Harp so important was that it was actually in the city center. Neutral ground for punks from across the sectarian divide could meet and socialize there in that pub, something that simply was not happening elsewhere. Of course, one shouldn't overstate the reality of the situation. Not everyone felt safe in that space. As Greg Cowan of The Outcast, with the jacket in the museum, has pointed out, quote, "You don't take a guy who's 16, 17, 18 years of age, and who's been brought up in a very bigoted community, and think he's going to walk in and go, let's hug a Catholic," end quote. But even with the pre-existing baggage, punks created their own community, their own non-sectarian community. And they worked really hard to preserve that harmony. When the English band The Damned casually asked their Belfast punk audience what football team they supported, which in the Northern Ireland context was an indicator of sectarian identity, the whole room fell silent rather than answer the question. Well, many observed that this non-sectarian punk community emerged not by any great design. When the A Center began organizing punk gigs a few years later, it was by design. And theirs was the same blueprint which then inspired the War Zone Collective to institutionalize a communal space that wasn't just non-sectarian, but anti-sectarian. While the Harp had provided a safe space, relatively safe space for punks to come together for pints and shows, the A Center and Gyros were places to put theory into action. Formed in 1984, the War Zone Collective opened its first physical space in '86, providing a popular cafe, a drop-in center, practice space, a venue, a recording studio, screen printing workshop. Sometimes referred to as the War Zone Center, most people called it Gyros, a name in honor of the unemployment benefit checks that sustained so many of its users. The space became a countercultural hub for Belfast and Northern Ireland. But the importance of the Belfast punk scene wasn't just about bringing youths together. It also altered the discursive terrain within Belfast and Northern Ireland in general. Just as the physical geography of the city was fragmented and policed by the state and the paramilitaries, symbols and words were highly charged and violently policed as well. Punk directly challenged both the polarization of discourse along sectarian lines, as well as the attempt to freeze the meaning within each side. Take just one example, the example of the Union Jack. This is not an inconsequential example, given that defacing the Union Jack or the image of the Queen was a common practice for punks in the London scene. But doing so could literally get you killed in the context of Northern Ireland. There, to deface these symbols was regarded as an act of allegiance to the Republican cause prior to the emergence of punk. But with punk, an alternative space was created where new meaning-making practices were enacted. Defacing the symbols of power was no longer seen exclusively as acts of sectarianism, but as pledging allegiance to an explicitly non-sectarian community. As punks redeployed symbols, language, and meaning in the discursive terrain of a conflict-torn Belfast, they were creating alternative practices of meaning-making beyond the limits of sectarianism, creating a language to imagine an alternative way of being. This was explicitly captured in the Stiff Little Fingers 1978 song, Alternative Ulster, with the chorus stressing personal empowerment and resistance to the status quo. An alternative Ulster. Grab it, change it, it's yours. Get an alternative Ulster. Ignore the Boers and their laws. Get an alternative Ulster. Be an anti-security force. Alter your native Ulster. Alter your native land. Now, punk in Belfast explicitly promoted political and cultural empowerment for a population that had been marginalized and terrorized. Belfast punks were not passive consumers, dreaming of an alternative Ulster in the safety of their bedrooms. That became more explicit in the 80s and 90s as punks like the War Zone Collective provided individuals with resources for participation and activism. It was about putting the rhetoric of punk into practice. As Chris McGee, a member of the collective, noted, quote, punk increasingly offered a space where questions could be asked about why society was divided and how those divisions could be overcome, offering a new politics entirely, end quote. Stuart Martin, another member of the War Zone Collective in the scene there, said, quote, it's one thing talking about doing things and theorizing, but these were practical examples of real stuff, real exciting alternative stuff happening, end quote. Thus, while politicians debated and negotiated about how to stop the violence, Belfast punks were building alternative ways of being that provided practical working examples for the rest of Belfast and Northern Ireland. For many, it wasn't just a fashion statement or a trend, but a vehicle with which to alter their social reality, not just to articulate a non-sectarian stance, but to actively practice anti-sectarianism, to imagine an alternative Ulster and make it a reality. The story of Belfast punk is a story of how punk helped bring peace to Northern Ireland and ultimately how, in the hands of the right people, popular culture can be a powerful instrument of change. Now, let me turn to my second example, which is Indonesia, and I'll start with what happened in December of 2011. Police descended upon a punk show in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, and arrested 64 teenagers for being punk. The concert was a fundraiser for local charities, but the police claimed that the organizers didn't have the right types of permits. They also claimed to have found marijuana and sharp objects that could be classified as weapons. The 64 youths were not actually arrested, but were taken to the Aceh state police camps and held for almost 2 weeks. Their heads were forcefully shaved, their clothes were burned, they were forced to pray and take communal baths to cleanse them. The Aceh authorities admitted the punks had not broken any laws, but yet were being detained for re-education. This clearly amounted to a focused and sustained harassment of the Aceh punk community. But why? Deputy Mayor Jamal justified her actions by stating, punk is a new social disease. Not surprisingly, the arrests were more about politics than religion. The deputy mayor was running for re-election and campaigning on being tough on crime. And for various reasons, the punks were easy and visible targets in Banda Aceh. In the end, the deputy mayor was re-elected. But there's a history of Indonesian punks challenging state authority that provides an important backdrop for understanding these events in Banda Aceh. Now, Indonesia is a massive country made up of 130,000 islands. It was colonized by the Dutch, occupied by the Japanese during World War II, declared itself independent in 1945, and then it fought a long war against the Dutch, who refused to recognize their independence until 1949. And then several decades later, General Suharto gained power and established the, quote, New Order regime that, thanks to American support, ruled the country with a repressive hand for almost 30 years. Faced with mounting popular pressure, Suharto was forced to step down in May 1998. Now, significantly, one of the driving social forces involved in bringing Suharto's New Order down was Indonesia's young, growing, and highly politicized punk community. Now, punk came to Indonesia in a substantial way during the 1990s. Now, while tapes of early punk bands like the Sex Pistols and the Dead Kennedys had circulated much earlier than that, it hadn't resulted in the massive growth of the scene like what happened in the 1990s. The influx of CDs and tapes by bands, commercial punk bands like Green Day, Bad Religion, Nirvana, is generally credited with sparking the DIY punk scenes across Indonesia. Of course, there's an irony here in the fact that commercial punk helped spread independent DIY punk culture, but in Indonesia it did. Well, definitely not in abject poverty. Indonesia was and is a developing country, so any active youth culture had to be DIY by necessity. Bootleg copies of Western DIY punk, hardcore, and metal bands began to circulate in the 1990s, and Indonesians began to form their own DIY punk bands, release their own tapes, establish their own record labels, and write their own zines, creating an active DIY punk scenes across Indonesia. All of this was occurring under the repressive control of Suharto's New Order. Despite their usual attempts to control crowds and clamp down on dissent, the government initially took very little notice of the growing punk culture. They provided organizers with permits to hold shows because they thought punk and independent music was just entertainment, a distraction for the kids. In reality, these shows were instrumental in mobilizing resistance to the Suharto regime. They became sites for both expressing anti-Suharto sentiment and organizing politically. Anti-government songs were played and circulated, political tracts disseminated, and actions were planned. Punks were organizing across the country. From Bali, which were one of the most famous bands at the time to emerge, was Superman is Dead, a name that was in direct reference to Suharto, all the way to Bandung, where bands like Turtle Jr. and Pupin released influential anti-government songs. Across Indonesia, you would see DIY record labels and distros emerging, circulating music and zines that dealt explicitly with social and political issues. Punks helped to form the very influential anti-fascist front, which was highly active in political resistance against Suharto's regime. The burgeoning DIY punk and metal scenes were important in empowering youth in their struggle to topple Suharto's New Order regime. Suharto's regime was eventually brought down in 1998 by countrywide protests, with the DIY punk scenes across Indonesia playing a pivotal role by being sites for political organization and collective action. Now, it needs to be noted that after the toppling of Suharto in 98, the DIY underground punk scenes in Indonesia have become more diverse and fragmented. They're massive, a huge number of punks across Indonesia, but they're very diverse and they're fragmented. As Hikmawan Saifullah has observed in his scholarship, excellent scholarship, that there's been a decline in the strength of left ideologies, and the number of left-wing underground collectives that were instrumental in the pro-democracy movement have actually collapsed. The predominance of neoliberal capitalism has changed the social relations between underground youth, frequently resulting in the shift from collaborative to a more competitive environment. This coincided with increasing religious conservatism and the rise of right-wing politics in Indonesia. And currently, there's been an interesting development of the rise of conservative Islamic underground youth movements, such as the One Finger movement in Jakarta, that Saifullah argues is a response to the absence of this coherent left in a scene that used to be critical of Indonesia's social and political conditions. I don't have time to delve into the richness of Indonesia's contemporary punk scenes right now, but there is some great scholarship out there, and I really recommend you take a look at it. Instead, I want to turn to Myanmar. I'm getting short on time, but I want to offer one contemporary example that illustrates how local punk scenes can be sites of political resistance. And I want to talk about Myanmar. Specifically, I want to talk about this band called Rebel Riot. Now, as many of you might know, a military dictatorship was established in Myanmar in 1962. Then it was known as Burma. And the military rule was characterized by systemic human rights abuses, and as well, we saw rampant ethnic strife across Myanmar. Now, that was shaken to its core by the Saffron Revolution in 2007, or the Saffron Revolution, which began in 2007, which was led by Buddhist monks. After the disputed general election of 2010, steps towards political liberalization were finally taken as a result of these protests and this pressure, including the release of Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. Though she was barred from running for office, she was eventually installed in a newly created position in 2016, akin to something like a prime minister. Now, last year, her party won the 2020 general election in a landslide. But before they could be installed, the military once again seized power, this time in February 2021, earlier this year. And since that time, a violent clampdown has occurred against opposition and against the civilian population. But in the cities across Myanmar, there have been regular and consistent street protests. And it should come as no surprise that the Myanmar punk community has been at the forefront here. It's worth stepping back and noting that while the 2007 Saffron Revolution is credited with being initiated by Buddhist monks, it spawned a larger civilian pro-democracy street protest. And from this popular protest, this band Rebel Riot came together. As like-minded punks, they found themselves protesting in the streets along with a bunch of other punks, and they came together. As frontman Kya Kya notes, the band name, Rebel Riot, is taken from English, was meant to convey the ethos of the band. As he says, we fight for freedom, we fight for justice. They continued as a band after the nominal return to civilian rule, but as Kya Kya reflects, quote, we didn't make much political music. We were shouting because we had the trauma of this revolution, so we needed to let our anger out. We were just singing punk songs about how we were sick of this society. But I think 2012 or 2010, we started writing about politics, about the system, and how people are so poor, end quote. Now, as with their shift towards being a more politically active and engaged band, they then were touring the region. In 2013, they toured Indonesia, which proved to be transformative. They happened to meet the founder of a local chapter of Food Not Bombs in Indonesia, and they dedicated themselves to replicating that model back in Myanmar, where they're cooking and distributing free food on a weekly basis. They're literally cooking the food amongst a larger community there of punks, and then going out and disseminating this food to whoever needs it. And it has grown immensely. A few years later, in 2015, they founded the offshoot Books Not Bombs in order to get books and education in the hands of the youth. And they eventually helped set up a free medical clinic. They became more of a collective than a band, right? The larger scene is emerging and coalescing around them. And in 2015, they also acquired a female co-lead singer, H-N-I-N, which was quite outside the societal norm in Myanmar. Now, in recent years, before the coup, they become human rights activists, directing attention to the plight of the Muslim minority population within Myanmar, the Rohingya, which was facing violent repression, if not outright genocide. Using their platform and the international networks that they had established, either directly from touring the region or virtually through their active internet presence, Rebel Riot became a powerful voice of opposition. So when the February 2021 military coup occurred, Rebel Riot and their community, their punk community, had already established a vibrant and vital network, both inside and outside the country. Within Myanmar, they've been active in organizing regular street protests and acts of resistance against military rule. They continue to maintain Food Not Bombs and other community outreach programs that help connect and politicize people. Internationally, they've been instrumental in maintaining attention on the plight of Myanmar. They have a significant following in the informal networks that connect DIY punk scenes across the globe. Through those networks, they've raised money and awareness to the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. And it remains to be seen what short and long-term impacts Rebel Riot and the DIY punk scenes will have in Myanmar, but they certainly will have one, if only from this generation of kids that now have access to food, education, and healthcare because of Myanmar punks. So to end my talk, I want to show the video with some English subtitles from Rebel Riot's most recent single about resisting the current military rule in Myanmar. This is their song, One Day. Okay, thank you so much for your time and attention. I do believe we now have a Q&A session scheduled, so I'll switch over to that. Thank you so much.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much. I really enjoyed your lecture as always, and it looks to me like we've already got some questions coming in.
Wonderful.
If it's okay, can I start you with a question from Maisie? How did your book come about?
Well, that's a great question. So, I've actually been involved in punk scenes since I was a young teen, and then going through college and graduate school, I was always active in punk scenes. And then as I began my career as a scholar, I found, and I work in African politics, international relations theory, and so I found myself traveling around the world, and wherever I would go for conferences or doing research, I would always just end up gravitating to the local punk scene, wherever that was. And I realized that I'd been conducting just informal research for years, and doing actually informal connecting of networks myself, where I was putting together people maybe from Scotland and Indonesia and South Africa. And then I just started realizing that, I'm sitting on this trove of information and having really smart conversations with punks around the world about what they're doing and some of the issues that they're facing. And I realized, I need to start writing about this, in a little bit of a scholarly way, but also just to document and to talk about what I'm doing, and hopefully in a way that people in the communities, the punk communities, can find useful. So that's what was driving the book there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I got another question here from Jamie, who's asking, he says, you look at punk movements across the world. What similarities and differences do you see in punk between countries?
That's a great question. You can always see similarities because there's certain symbols or practices that tend to travel, right? You're going to see some exploited patch or Dead Kennedys patch, or the kind of symbols of mohawks and leather jackets and things like that. Some of the kind of just tropes or symbols that aesthetically help define scenes, or if those are being employed. And they're not always being employed, but there's these certain similarities, that just kind of the aesthetic similarities that local scenes kind of draw from this global punk culture. And then the differences are how those are then interpreted, how people are drawing from this larger global network, these larger global cultural, social practices and cultural cachet, if you will, and then utilizing it for their own individual needs and their own local community needs. So like the differences will, the conversations that maybe the punks in Myanmar and Indonesia, there may be some similarities, but they're also very different, right? Even though we might think of them as, these Asian countries, they must have similar issues around democracy, but they don't, right? There's some shared connection and shared conversations going back and forth. But the Myanmar community is quite distinct than say the one in Jakarta, or even in Indonesia. The Jakarta scene is very distinct from the Bandung or the Aceh scene. And you can see the connections, but they're also distinct in their own way. And of course, they're evolving over time, right? Hopefully that came across, we're talking about Indonesia. The Indonesian punk scenes of today are different than they were 5 or 10 years ago when I've been doing research there, so.
Kevin, before I go on to the next question, because I want to follow up on what this is a really interesting question for me as well. And I know you share this interest in the question of how punk travels, right? And whether the communities could actually be described as being tied to countries, whether the differences are country differences, or whether they actually define another kind of political being or political space to that of, the international relations of Indonesia in relation to Myanmar, in relation to former colonial states. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. And I find it really fascinating the way in which these connections and networks and circuits are taking place throughout the global punk communities, and then within regional and local punk communities as well. One of the things I'm always aware of is, I answered Macy's question by commenting on my own ability to travel fairly easy across the globe. And that is a huge position of privilege that I have. And other people and other products don't travel these circuits and networks with the same degree of ease as others do. So, a band, say, from the United States is going to have an easier time, or the UK or whoever, it's going to be an easier time traveling and doing tours around the globe than, say, a band from Indonesia or Myanmar or South Africa who's trying to get into the US, the UK, European Union. So they physically, as humans, there's some restrictions, and there's also restrictions in terms of global products. Cassettes and CDs travel in different ways, some of which more effectively have a greater ability to move across borders than others. Though that is changing, right? One of the things that I've been noticing in my own life, right, is seeing the ways in which global technologies, information communication technologies, has changed the landscape by which global punk products and local communities talk to each other and can move information and music and ideas across borders in ways that they couldn't 10, 20 years ago, which is phenomenal, right? The way in which Rebel Riot, for example, my example there at the end, is able to communicate and get ideas across, whether it's their videos, whether it's their ideas, whether it's raising money and moving money through Venmo or PayPal or whatever. We could not have imagined that happening 15 years ago or 30 years ago. East European punks who are also resisting, say, a repressive state, were not having that kind of connectivity. So that's been fascinating to witness as well.
I'm gonna take a liberty here, because I've got a question I need to come back to in just a second to follow on. But what you just said, there's kind of a hot pursuit question, a question from YouTube that suggests that the internet has made it so that anyone can self-publish music. And you're wondering, the questioner was wondering whether this could help the punks seem to be more effective at forming communities for change, or whether it tends to atomize communities. Do you see any kind of a backlash, or any way that it may be the kinds of technologies you're looking at that facilitate this movement also produce greater barriers for people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think my answer is that we see both, right? It's a simultaneous movement, right, where it is easier to get information out into these global networks, right? So if you're a local band, say in Myanmar or in South Africa, I keep going back to the same examples for some reason, and you're able to get, you're better able to get that music or these ideas out there to the global audience. But at the same time, we as consumers are just overwhelmed with this wave, this static of information. So if you think back to the beginning of punk culture emerging US, UK, as it's moving slowly across, you could be aware, you wouldn't know all the bands, obviously, but you knew that certain bands could percolate, and that it was easier to get people's attention because there was less amount of noise just going on, and so that you were able to set yourself apart, and you were more able to get access to information because there were a couple of key nodal points in terms of disseminating information within the global punk community, whether it's Maximum Rock and Roll or Trouser Press or Punk Planet, the various zines and things like that, where today there's just so much information that it's at your fingertips, but at the same time, it takes work to get to. So the ability to make those connections is both increased but also decreased by these changing information and communication technologies that we see in today's globalized world.
That's great, man. So I skipped over one of the questions. I don't know if the audience can sort of see the order that they're showing up. So I apologize to the person who I skipped over. I'm going to come back to him now because the other part of the question that I wanted to put to you, in addition to these traveling and connections, was the question about political identity and whether it's actually tied to nations through the punk scene. And I think that there were a comment and a question that came up here about specifically about the Belfast and about the Northern Ireland situation that I think really speak interestingly to that. So there's a question from Simon who says, this was an interesting description of the punk scene in Northern Ireland, but did it have a real impact in bringing peace to the province? And if you could explain, just to add to that, this is the comment from Tim, really interesting. It says, I grew up in suburban East Belfast in the 70s and early 80s, but sadly knew very little about the city's vibrant punk culture, which you described. However, to illustrate the extent of the internal schisms within Ulster culture at the time, the only true punk in my school year was the younger brother of the future leader of the Ulster Unionist Party.
Right.
Cause or effect, you decide.
Yeah. So there's several things I can go down here. Right. One is I'm going to go to, was it Tim who made that last comment there? I think that's a really insightful point, is that I believe that punk is offering these tools for political empowerment and engagement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to become a progressive, anarchist, socialist, or what have you. In fact, the Belfast scene, I won't start naming names, of folks who actually were within the punk scenes who gravitated towards, whether it was an extreme Republican or extreme nationalist unionist position, some of which were very much involved in using violence, so that their politics was what they were reproducing, a xenophobic, maybe a more violence than a kind of a progressive image that I might have conveyed in just kind of talking about the Belfast scene as contributing to the peace process. And we see the way in which neo-Nazis have kind of utilized a lot of and become part of the punk scenes in certain parts of Eastern Europe and Russia. I kind of gestured that towards the end, where we see the more conservative right-wing Islamist groups emerging within the punk communities in Indonesia and elsewhere. So that's definitely true. I don't want to give an image that, political punk is just progressive one way. I do, but the other question, I can't remember who said that. I forget. I apologize. About did punk actually contribute to the peace? And I'm not sure if we're talking about the province, right? So we're thinking about out in the provinces, right? Outside of Belfast and Derry, what was the work that punk was doing? Because the rural-urban split within Northern Ireland is fascinating, right? And it had, I think, some important implications that I can't untie right here, but I think that's a valid observation in terms of if they're making a distinction between how peace was realized and what that meant for urban spaces and rural spaces. I think that's valid. But if the question is largely questioning or challenging my assumption that peace was contributed, or the development of peace, that punk played a contributing factor, I think it did. And I think there's lots of clear evidence of that in ways that we see a number of activists who are going to be key in terms of bringing about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, or working from a punk background, or backgrounds that were informed by the scene that the punk community in Belfast, and to a lesser extent Derry, were generating, and how there's that third space that now peace becomes possible. And it wasn't just the punks, right? It was a lot of other people doing a lot of hard work on the ground, right? Of course, George Mitchell from the US comes in and gets to grab the glory from negotiating this, but the hard work of creating the context by which peace was realized, a very tentative peace, right? Because I'm still going back to Belfast, I'll be there in a few months. I know how tentative things are, is very much part of the way punk scenes contributed to that. And one thing that I find interesting I didn't talk about is the way in which Belfast today waxes nostalgically and is memorializing punk as part of that process. And the way they do that, whether it's the harp has a little plaque there right by it, there's murals going up, the Outcast jacket is in the museum, the way in which punk is now being incorporated into this narrative of the peace process, which part of what I'm responding to is that that's a too slick and easy narrative to construct, right? Because the punk scene was more nuanced, because we did have some quasi neo-fascist in the mix as well. And that it was complicated, and that a lot of the hard work was actually done for me in the 80s and 90s around the War Zone Collective, that kind of approach, rather than the Terry Hooley Good Vibrations folks who get the movies and get the musicals about them, but it's actually the hard work was done in the 80s and 90s in a much more DIY fashion there. But it is fascinating to see how punks are being memorialized now in the Belfast narrative, and I think that narrative is too neat, too clean, and is too narrow as well.
Yeah, as it ever is, right?
Right.
That's on that note. There's another fascinating question here from Yarn School. Asks, is there currently a meaningful politicized British punk scene? So if we move over from Ireland and Northern Ireland to this side of the Irish Sea, what do you see going on here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one of the interesting things is my eye caught a question asking me how old I am. And so I'm older than punk, right? So I'm older than punk. I was alive, and I know when punk started in 1977. And so one of the kind of interesting things for me to answer this question is I grew up very much attuned to the US and the UK punk scenes. And I could tell you a lot about what was developing. But for the last 10 years, I listen to a lot of British punk, right? I'm a huge fan of Wonk Unit, for example. I think there's a bunch of other great DIY stuff that's coming out. But I spend so much more time thinking about the political work that punk's doing outside of the usual areas that we talk about within punk scholarship, the US, UK. So I'm actually not, I don't feel comfortable talking about the political work they're doing. Yeah. Though I know a whole bunch of British punk bands, but yeah.
Well, I mean, so apologies to Yarn School, but Yarn School is a great name for a punk band.
It's a good name for a punk band, right?
And do it yourself, right?
Yeah.
Got another question here, a very interesting one from Olivia, and she wonders: does punk interact with other subcultures, or does it try to stay an independent phenomenon?
That's a really good question. Of course, it's going to vary. But one of the things that I was struck by was when I first started doing work in Indonesia, how the DIY punk scenes worked really hand in hand with the DIY metal scenes. And there was a connection between punk and metal. And for myself, when I was growing up, and again, I'm older than punk, the punks and the metalheads were like, they did not cross over, right? Okay, we might meet to talk about Metallica, or Motorhead, but that was it, right? And so in some cases, there has been much more connectivity with other musical genres, and sometimes that's very locally specific, right? The way in which, for example, I'm interested in New Orleans punk scenes, and the way that it fits in actually with a lot of the New Orleans kind of traditional music, and from jazz to the developing very distinct hip hop scenes in New Orleans here in the United States, how that contributes. Other places are much more, autonomous with a wall up to delineate themselves. But I also think that, and this is something that Matt and I kind of mentioned beforehand, is the way in which in 21st century, 2021, a lot of new and emerging bands and musicians get access to all sorts of different genres, and there's all at their fingers. So they're drawing, and there's more of a pastiche where they're drawing and utilizing different elements. And so I referenced Youngblood, who my daughter is a huge fan of, who, if you see Youngblood, Matt, I don't know if you know Youngblood, but he'll have a chain with a lock. I mean, it's very Sid Vicious. I mean, he's emoting Sid Vicious, a lot of punk symbolism, but he's also drawing from hip hop culture, Arctic Monkeys, a lot of other things to create his own genre. And the punk element is very much there, but he's utilizing that or appropriating it, and some might say, but I would say utilizing that in different ways to create something that for him is quite distinct.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm also find myself really dwelling on this particular question. I think, like Janice, well, I'm actually older than Kevin, and for me, your description of these sort of possibilities of crossovers is just so interesting because I think my initial experience of punk was not at all political. As a 17-year-old, right? The first thing it was absolutely cultural. It was absolutely finding myself listening to the same records over and over again, and then somebody showing up at my house with Patti Smith, and it's like, oh my God, what have I been missing? What have I been doing with my life, right? So we got two final questions, Kevin, I'm going to put to you. First one is, does the distinction between this is from YouTube, does the distinction between DIY and mainstream punk create more divisions in the community where mainstream music can onboard people more into the political realms?
Yeah. Sorry, was there two questions or should I go with that one?
The second one is from Emily on Twitter. And she says, do you think music videos are becoming important ways for global punks to share messages across language barriers? So actually, they're kind of related.
They are, right. And that second question, I think is great, right? Because the ways in which with technology now, bands can make their own music videos and put them up on YouTube. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I think we consume music in different ways. And one of the ways is through music videos where, you'll put on your YouTube and create a playlist or hit shuffle or what have you. And so YouTube, whether it's in addition to Spotify and other things, but YouTube is actually, I think, more democratic, if you will, than say Spotify or Pandora, right? I think that is definitely a way in which bands communicate with each other and get their messages out. It's definitely, I see that occurring across local scenes. The question was the other question, which was about the distinction between DIY and mainstream. There's interesting gatekeeping that always goes on in any genre, right? Whether, that is mainstream country music or jazz, or it's too commercial and what I listen to is more authentic. And so there's definitely that gatekeeping there. And part of that gatekeeping is about identity formation, and trying to protect. But I think actually when we're talking about the distinction between, say, a DIY and a commercial, what we're actually looking at is the methods by which music or any cultural product is being generated, being produced, and being distributed. And I always go back to Walter Benjamin's point about the author as a cultural producer, in terms of when the author is actually being a political actor. It's not so much what they're saying, but how they're saying it, the method that they're saying it. So if you take a song, a musician who's singing about how bad capitalism is, right? That's fine. That's great. But if one is doing so through a kind of mainstream or commercial, they're on a major record label that is tied in with the defense industry, and they're making gazillion dollars, and not giving it to their employees or their musicians, versus someone who's singing about how bad capitalism is, and they're on a small DIY record label, and they're working within a DIY method. The distinction between commercial and DIY is actually really important, because I think it's drawing attention to the political power of the ways and the methods in which they're engaging in cultural production, and that controlling, distributing the consumption at the DIY level. That is actually where some political relevance and political power is possible, much less so in terms of the commercial. So I see that that's an important distinction, not just in terms of maintaining barriers of authenticity, but also pointing out the political relevance of cultural practices.
Kevin, that's a great point to wrap up on, right? I think that the major thing here is about who gets to act and not necessarily what they're saying. And I think that's right. A wonderful point. This has been a brilliant lecture and a brilliant conversation, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing your time with us. This is a real privilege to share the screen with you, man. Thanks so much. It is so nice to be here. I wish I was in Newcastle, but keeping our carbon footprint down during COP26, right? This is good. I really appreciate everybody tuning in and asking these great questions, and I thank you and the great folks at Newcastle for letting me be here. Yeah, we'll applaud you now. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, though. So thanks again, Kevin. I want to thank our audience also for watching. I need to also just do a little housekeeping. Our next event will be on Thursday, November 4th, and it's called Putting Disadvantaged Children at the Heart of Recovery, and our speaker will be Anne Longfield. We hope you'll join us then.